Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's session. We have Angharad Welch here with us from, I have completely forgotten which company it is, I should have top of my screen. You can tell them in a minute, who is going to talk to us about speech and language in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 and some strategies and things that we can do to support those students. And so rather than listening to me waffle on, I'm just going to pass straight over to her. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I thought I would talk about SLCN in Key Stage 2 and 3 today because having spent quite a lot of time in schools the last couple of years, I realised that there's a relatively large amount of information out there if for early years and sort of less so, but still quite a lot for Key Stage 1. And then when it gets to Key Stage 2 and 3, everything sort of falls off a cliff really in terms of published interventions and people giving you advice online. And certainly locally where I live, our services start to really drop off when we get to Key Stage 2, and we have no NHS provision at all at secondary level in our county. So I thought this would probably be an interesting topic to talk about because I realise it's one that SENCOs don't get that much support with. So who am I? So my name's Angharad, and my company is called Find The Key Speech and Language Therapy. And my background, so I've been a speech therapist for 17 years, and until about 3 years ago, I was an NHS therapist. And my background in the NHS, I've worked in a few different fields really, but I started off working more in Sure Start, if anybody is old enough to remember when Sure Start existed, Sure Start and children's centres. So I worked a lot with families and in a sort of public health model. And then basically as an NHS therapist, I've worked more in complex needs, so complex physical disability, learning disability, and also feeding and swallowing issues. So I've got quite a niche background in terms of my NHS background, but about 3 years ago, I've quietly worked my way up to full-time in my own business, and my business actually specialises in working with mainstream settings. So I've got quite a range of different experiences really. And I actually really like my passion really. I love working with the young people, but I really enjoy working with the adults who work with the young people. And I like spreading my skills around as far as they will go, which is just as well because none of us has really got the time to keep our skills to ourselves, have we? So what has brought me here to talk to you about this specifically today, I'm really aware that in an ideal universe, you should be getting specialist assessment for your older primary and secondary students, and you should be getting good quality guidance from speech and language therapy about what interventions to run. But I'm really aware that the reality is that you're probably not getting a whole lot of support with your SLCN. So what we're going to do today basically is I'm going to run through some the sort of key areas that children tend to still be struggling with speech and language wise by the time they get to high end of primary and into secondary, and then the main sort of published interventions that I'm aware of. There might well be some out there that I'm not aware of, but the main ones that I'm aware of that are applicable to that age group. And there'll be time for questions at the end. So you might hear me slip into talking about secondary a little bit more. You can just assume that I'm talking about Key Stage 2 and 3. There's a reason I've split it that way. Traditionally, we think about primary and secondary, don't we? But actually, from my perspective, what I'm finding more and more is that when I am working in secondary schools, the big complaint I have from SENCOs is that primary isn't preparing these young people for the skills they need for when they get into secondary. And I know exactly why that is. It's because you guys in primary just don't have time. You're busy working on the stuff that you need to work on in primary. And it occurs to me really, working with more children in Key Stage 2 now, that we need to be starting the skills that they need to build for secondary. We need to be starting to sow those seeds a little bit earlier really. So just to give you the big picture of what SLCN looks like in these children and the big picture in the education setting, this is a really nice document. If you are looking for any evidence to talk to your SLT or anything, or just kind of to feel secure when you're talking about SLCN, it is not terribly new. I think it came out in 2011 actually, but I've got no reason to think, all the references and whatever are pretty robust, and I've got no reason to think at all that anything's changed, to be honest, sadly. And it gives you a really nice overview of the needs you can expect in the secondary population and planning for those needs. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. So we're just going to set a context really of SLCN as children get older, and I've taken this from that same report. So basically what we see as children move towards secondary is that when they're leaving primary, about 26.5% of children on SEN registers are labelled as having SLCN. And suddenly, upon entry to secondary, only 7.8% of these children now have an SLCN label, but we have a massive increase in the behaviour, emotional, social development label, which is very interesting, isn't it? So these children sort of disappear from view, and I find that across primary school really. So we're often really good at identifying children at the beginning end of primary when they come in not talking. We're really good at identifying those children. As they get more verbal and superficially able to deal with the demands of school, they start drifting away from concern. People aren't so worried. And then what I'm finding in Key Stage 2 is that there are a group who sometimes they've never had any speech and language assessment because they've been seen to catch up, but they've got these stubborn literacy difficulties. And when we're assessing them for speech and language, they actually have a whole range of speech and language issues that have been the barrier to them accessing the literacy interventions as well. So I think SLCN, our understanding of what it looks like, and probably needs to be more subtle across different stages of the education system, because these children they're bright children who are coping and managing as best they can with the skills they've got, and they often develop skills that are good enough to pass muster in many informal situations. So they get a bit lost from view really in terms of them accessing services. But we know that those children are still there. Their SLCN hasn't actually gone anywhere. So it's really important to kind of keep that SLCN focus in the back of our mind, basically. Because as you can imagine, our SLCN quite quickly can turn up as behavioural and emotional problems. And we know that SLCN is vastly overrepresented in terms of the mental health needs population. I know you had Mabel coming to talk to you about that the other day, didn't you? We know that there are vast numbers of children with SLCN in the population of children who need CAMS, for example, but they're less able to access the kind of talking support that's on offer often. Okay, so what does support look like at the moment for these children, and what, in my humble opinion, should it look like? So we're often pretty good in early years and Key Stage 1. In terms of our interventions, there are quite a good range of interventions that are available. I mean, oftentimes people get a bit phased by the sheer volume of interventions you can buy at early years in Key Stage 1, which is ironic given that there's hardly any as you get older. But a lot of the interventions in early years in Key Stage 1 are very impairment focused. So, the children can't listen, so we teach them to listen. They don't know their vocab, so we teach them their vocab. And as the children get older, they may or may not have made progress with those interventions. And what tends to happen is that either we keep going with those interventions sometimes, or we consider them to have caught up and we stop giving them interventions, or maybe we think, oh, we're not getting anywhere here. And that's often at the point when schools are starting to think, I've run out of ways to tackle this SLCN. That's often when speech language services often stop as well, hopefully. So as we move through school, we have to acknowledge really that if you've still got SLCN by the time you get to Key Stage 2 and beyond, you've probably got lifelong SLCN to one extent or another. And we need to start turning our focus really to encouraging children to take control of their own learning, to understand their own learning better, to identify the strategies that are going to help them personally, and to think about how they function. So, we're probably not going to fix their impairment in speech and language if they've still got it by Key Stage 2. And we need to be thinking about how to support children to live with the difficulties they've got really and be the best learners they can be. Okay, so I'm going to just run through the main areas of need that I see in terms of children's skills. The big one definitely is working memory. So when I'm assessing children in Key Stage 2 and beyond, I can almost, without looking at the assessment, guarantee you that they've got short-term working memory issues. Obviously, from my perspective, I'm often talking about auditory working memory. Now, I know loads of your students will have working memory problems, but in terms of speech and language, what that can look like, functionally speaking, is, for example, difficulties processing longer instructions, understanding and using more complex grammar. So the kind of stuff you're going to come up against in textbooks, for example, is much more complicated than conversational language. Understanding and recalling vocabulary. So a lot of the young people I work with, if you use a multisyllabic word, particularly one that's quite specialist, say something from the science curriculum, then they often, just when they're repeating it back to you, you can tell that they're really struggling to hold all the syllables in their head and understand what sounds make up those syllables. And then remembering and analysing sounds in words for reading and clear speech. So a lot of times what I find at Key Stage 2 is that a lot of the strategies that we're putting in to support their literacy actually require quite a lot of working memory. We ask children to verbalise sentences and then to work through them and sort of sound them out for themselves, but actually they've often forgotten the sentence that they were going for by the time they get to the end, and then they're struggling with the decoding, and the whole thing is just so slow that they just sort of lose the energy for tackling it, really. And then by the time they get into secondary, they've often become quite used to not quite following what's going on and quite disempowered, and they've often not got great strategies for working out what to do about it. I don't know if that sounds familiar. So there's not a whole lot of memory interventions out there, to be honest with you, not ones that kind of come in a nice package for you to pick up and do. This is my personal favourite. It's called Memory Magic. Now, I will say the proviso with all of these, really, most of them, they're hardly ever written specifically for secondary. So you can't get away from the fact often that they do just look sometimes a bit babyish, the resources. And I'm often having to improvise a little bit to make them feel more acceptable to secondary students. If you Google Memory Magic, you will see there's not much out there about Memory Magic, except there is an Ed Psych, who I do not know the name of off the top of my head, wrote a very nice analysis of whether it was evidence-based or not a few years ago, and they rightly say that the actual strategies within Memory Magic are perfectly sort of well sourced from the evidence base, but what there isn't evidence for, and this is a real issue, particularly at secondary, I think, is there isn't evidence for removing children working on their memory as a splinter skill, putting them back in the classroom. What they need to do is generalise that skill. So, and I think you can take it for granted, really, that everything I'm going to mention here is probably not going to transfer into everyday situations without an active strategy to help the young people apply all these strategies I'm going to be talking about. So just working through an intervention doesn't work terribly well as the children get older, partly because not every strategy is going to be right for every person. And what I find is that children are often a bit baffled. The language levels are already so high in class. They're already a bit phased by trying to deal with the language levels. And so then when you say, well, use that strategy I just taught you in that group, then they just can't do it all. So we need to plan in ways to help them use the strategies we're teaching them. So Memory Magic is actually split into, it's quite a nice program. It's split into the most kind of commonly used memory management strategies. So we know that we can't really improve working memory in the sense of, you know, making it bigger, but what we can do is teach the young people to use it more effectively. So it splits the program into what they call magic tricks, so different memory strategies, and there are loads of activities under each of the strategies on the right hand side to help them practice that strategy. And then at the end of the program, so this whole program sometimes will take me over a year to deliver, because you know you want to work through it nice and slowly, help them generalize it. So the idea is at the end that each individual child or young person will come up with their personal mix of strategies that work well for them. So I think one of the challenges at Key Stage 2 and 3 is that really in an ideal world you'd be delivering this and actually skilling up all your TAs in the strategies so that they can be encouraging the same strategies in class. And I know that's something of a challenge. There you go. Okay, so yeah, the rub is that we must be supporting children and young people to generalise the strategies into everyday situations. So I know that's a huge barrier. It's hard enough to find the intervention time, isn't it, and organise the interventions, but actually we're wasting our time in those interventions really if we're not finding ways to help them identify how to apply what we want. Okay, and then higher level language skills. So I've just pulled out a few here that I'm sure are familiar to you. So things like, for example, different verbal reasoning skills. So inferencing, predicting, for example, narrative skills. So a lot of the young people I'm working with, they're pretty good at sort of sentence level. And I find a lot of speech and language interventions, we're pretty good to sentence level. And then sometimes we get a bit vague when it comes to actually linking our ideas together and sequencing them and doing the higher level stuff. And they often sort of fall off the end of the age range in terms of what you can access from NHS therapy before we've got into lots and lots of this. So there's lots of crossover here. Oftentimes the children get reasonably good at doing this stuff verbally, but then when you put them in a context where they need to use those skills with a piece of text, they really struggle. So a lot of the skills we're talking about in terms of higher level language skills have got a big crossover with how, you know, the skills they need to tackle reading in terms of their comprehension as well. And oftentimes they haven't quite made that link that most people would do implicitly. You know, they just naturally move over from the verbal skill to the written skill very naturally, and a lot of our children with SLCN don't do that without a bit of help. Okay, so in terms of interventions, so I don't know if you're familiar with her, but this lady here, Victoria Joffe, is well worth, I think she's on Twitter, if you're Twitter people. She is, in the speech therapy world, she is very interested in secondary interventions in particular. So she's a good person to follow, actually. So the two interventions that I'm going to mention in this session are both specifically written with secondary in mind, which is really nice. I think those are probably the only two interventions that are specifically for secondary, but actually they work really nicely for Key Stage 2 as well. So the narrative intervention program is great. And then you are probably familiar with this intervention. It gets used a lot, language for thinking. So you'll see it says a structured approach for young children, but actually you see it being used for older children all the time. And this is based around the blank verbal reasoning model, very popular in Key Stage 2 and 3. And once you've got the idea of the language for thinking sort of structure, you can adapt it to lots of different things. Okay, and then vocabulary is a really big one that I'm often working on in Key Stage 2 and 3. So we know that vocabulary is a really good predictor of attainment and life outcomes. There's loads written about that, aren't there? Loads of books about the vocabulary gap. And we also know that the vocabulary gap between children with and without SLCN tends to widen over time. It gets wider at secondary, presumably because we are adding so much technical vocabulary knowledge when we get to secondary level. And oftentimes children just don't have the skills to tackle that vocabulary. Again, one of the big issues really is that children get so used to not understanding, they've got nothing to compare it to really. So to them, not understanding, not knowing what words mean is pretty normal. So they don't, even if we say to them, do you understand? They don't have a whole lot else to compare it with. So they'll say, yes, I understand, when actually they don't. So vocabulary is well worth spending some time on. So the kind of skills we're talking about is, for example, encouraging identification of words you don't know. So I will often, with a lot of the skills we need to practice at secondary, I often work on them in the written form first, actually, because just by its nature, it's there and we can practice looking at words we don't know over quite a long period. We can spend as long as you like, whereas that verbal signal is come and it's gone before the children have had time to latch on to which words they didn't understand. So I often start with the written word first, actually. So yes, encourage them to notice when they don't know the words in front of them. Teaching different vocab skills, so you know, dictionary skills, for example. I personally do a lot of word mapping, so basically making a visual map of things that we know about the words. You know, what word classes do they go into, how many syllables, what topic do they come from, anything that you can do to help them with those links between words. So a lot of your children with SLCN, they get pretty good at learning the word itself, but they're often pretty thin when it comes to understanding how those words go together. So again, superficially, they get words in their vocabulary, but they don't really understand how those words relate to other words in a topic, for example. And that means that their understanding of that word is relatively shallow, and also they are much less likely to be able to retrieve that word when they need it, because it's sort of just floating around there in their head, a little bit unconnected to everything else. So we need to help them overtly make those links, really. I'm sure pre-learning vocab is something that gets mentioned to you all the time. So, you know, basically these children need many more opportunities to make links between words than most other children. And then focusing on tier 2 vocab, particularly as you get towards secondary. So that's cross-curricular vocab. So rather than focusing on the quite niche tier 3 vocabulary, you know, like chlorophyll and electron and words like that, focusing on children's really thorough understanding of the words that are going to be coming up across, you know, exam questions and essays. So compare, describe, predict, words like that. They're actually pretty hard to wrap your head around once you start trying to explain what they mean. And I often need loads and loads and loads of practice at working on those words so that they've got some way into some of the exam questions and homework and that kind of thing. So in terms of general vocab strategies, that's the kind of thing. And what I would say at secondary is there is nothing stopping anybody kind of picking out the skills. You don't necessarily need a published programme to tackle any of this stuff. It's just we all know we don't have enough time really. So there is quite a lot of stuff out there that you could use to pull together all these strategies individually, should you so wish. But the reality is I know that most people need something they can use at least as a backbone for an intervention. So again, this is Victoria Joffe's intervention in this area. This is a really nice programme actually. So it really slowly and thoroughly works through a lot of the basics around vocab that most children have just absorbed through teaching by the end of Key Stage 1. I really rate this programme, and you can pull in vocabulary from your own subject areas and things as you need to. So I myself, the vocab enrichment intervention programme and the narrative programme are on my shelf and I use them quite a lot. So if you were going to buy two, those would be a good place to start. These are some free resources around vocab. So this one here at the bottom, this lady actually ran, I think it was for her PhD, she did an adolescent vocabulary group in a secondary school, and basically all her resources and session plans are on this website for you to use as a starting point. And then this has just come out in the last month or so, this top one here. I would thoroughly recommend, if you're interested in SLCN, following the informed SLP, so speech language pathologists, so the American version of speech therapy, because even if you don't join up to their services, just following them, you get all sorts of nice blogs and things, and they bring out lovely blogs and free resources for you that you can just use. And there's actually a lot more out there than you think, and they've bothered to kind of collect it all in one place, so well worth following. Okay, and then pulling all those language skills together, we know that one of the reasons children with SLCN struggle so much as they get older is that our social contexts as we move towards adulthood become very linguistically based. You know, we do a lot of chat, don't we, as we get older, and so we really need good social skills and self-regulation as we move through our teenage years, and it's something that our children with SLCN really struggle with. So I think it's really important we're addressing that as part of their interventions. So I'm just going to mention two resources. I really highly rate this one on the left, Language for Behaviour and Emotions. It's only come out a year or two ago. These are the same authors who wrote the Language for Thinking, and also, if some of you in primary, the Word Aware approach as well. So this is a really nice, thorough resource. It's mostly based around developing skills with verbal, but you could very easily bring in the written form as well. So it's got really nice assessments for baselining, and it would very easily lend itself either to one-to-one intervention or a group. So I would thoroughly recommend that one, because there's not that much out there for older primary and teenagers that goes into that much depth in terms of intervention. And then social skills interventions, I am moving away myself a little bit from structured social skills interventions like your talk about and that kind of thing. And the reason for that being that, you know, the feedback we're getting from autistic people is that it is really hard for us to teach social skills in a way that doesn't encourage them to mask and basically create more mental health problems for them in terms of how they're presenting in the world. And I think it's a really hard line to tread. And I think you can completely use those interventions in a way that is helpful for those young people. But I do think it's really highly skilled thing to do. And oftentimes the interventions get a bit diluted, and helping people understand the difference between helping people who are having trouble with their social skills understand social skills and teaching them to mask their natural social skills are, you know, it's quite a subtle distinction by the time it's got watered down and delivered. So I am starting to move away a little bit from those interventions. I personally do really like comic strip conversations though, and I know social stories are a very common intervention and they're great too. The main problem with social stories from my perspective is, again, oftentimes people haven't had access to the appropriate training, and it's very easy for social skills to slip from being a tool for developing social understanding into being a tool for telling children what to do. And so, again, it's a kind of subtlety that sometimes gets a bit lost in the mix. Comic strip conversations are by the same person as social stories. I find them personally a really great tool as the children get older. So what you do with comic strip conversations is you would actually have a conversation with a young person, oftentimes about something that's actually happened in their everyday life, and you basically draw out what's happened using stick people, and then you use various colours and shapes. It's fairly easy to learn. So what was said, and then what are the people thinking whilst they said those things, and helping young people have those conversations to identify what cues were there in those social situations that would help them understand what people might be thinking as well as just what was being said, and understanding their emotions a bit better. So I really like the comic strip conversations because I find social situations start getting so complex as you get into secondary that it's quite hard to capture that stuff in a social story, whereas comic strip conversations, they're very spontaneous sort of intervention. So they're meant to deal with things in sort of real time, really, almost. So you can adapt them much more easily, I think, to the social situations in front of you, instead of trying to capture every eventuality in a social story. So that's my personal take on social interventions. I think it's really, really hard to get the social side right for children with SLCN personally. So if I was only going to buy one resource, I'd probably buy the language for behaviour and emotions myself. Okay. And then study skills and how to deal with homework and that kind of thing is a vexed topic. So oftentimes in primary, children have become quite reliant on TA support, for example. So, I mean, depending on your child and their personality and their coping strategies, if they do realise they need support, they've often become quite used to an adult coming along and sort of anticipating that support for them. And then they really struggle when they have to do these things independently and learn how to tackle their studies. So the only intervention around SLCN that I'm aware of, but people can tell me if I'm wrong, is this one, which is really nice. Again, came out a couple of years ago, and it's designed as a group programme, and it literally teaches children what revision is as a starting point. Really nice, positive programme, talks a lot about some of the different labels that they might have, you know, some of the different diagnoses they might have, famous people who have those, and talks a bit about their strengths and needs as when it comes to studying, and then works through lots of different ways of approaching study. You know, are you a visual person? We can mind map, teaches you how to make note cards, for example. Basically loads and loads of different approaches to study. Personally, I wouldn't wait to start using this program until you're in that active revision phase, because it does take so long often to teach young people these skills. So you'll see all the things I'm talking about here, there's quite a lot of crossover in terms of skills, you know, memory and note taking, and you know, how we make a revision map for ourselves, things like that. And the earlier we can start working on some of this stuff. So it's always amazing to me, really, that in primary in particular, we don't teach children to make notes when we're talking or anything like that particularly. So as an adult, if I'm tackling a new text or listening to a lecture, particularly with unfamiliar material, I'll always be writing to help me process what I'm doing, or making notes or doodling something. But actually, we don't actively encourage those skills as children get older. We sort of just expect them to know how to do it, don't we? And what these sorts of programs do, and there's elements of this woven through lots of the interventions here, is actively teaching you how to do that stuff for yourself, really. So this is a really, really nice program, and I don't think it's just for children with SLCN. If you've got people in your school with you know, wider learning disabilities, it's actually just a really nice structured program. It's great, isn't it, to have a program that you can just pick up and use every week and not have to improvise too much. So I thoroughly recommend these. And none of the programs I'm mentioning here kind of cost the earth from my perspective. I know it adds up, but you know, they're all in somewhere in the 30 to 40 quid sort of range, really, and which is pretty good. I think the Memory Magic one's 60, but you know, in the world of interventions, that's not too bad, I don't think. Quite easy to sort of pick up a lot of stock of these. Okay, and then we come to the sort of wider picture, really, and I'm not suggesting that these are SLCN skills by any means, but the thing that really our young people come to struggle with are these executive functioning skills, aren't they? You know, partly because they're teenagers. So a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of their SLCN very much crossover with these executive functioning skills that are going to help them be independent. So, you know, I'm sure we talk about children's attention and listening all the time. I do. Their memory, like I've already said, so note-taking, metacognition, problem-solving, initiation, organisation. I think I'm just giving you a list of all the things that your students struggle with, probably. So again, now I don't have a specific intervention for executive functioning. What I tend to do is I will be actively weaving practice of some of these things through my other interventions. So for example, at the moment I'm working in a secondary and we are doing an independent learning group, and one of the big things we're working on is reading comprehension, and so I also work in vocabulary skills and some of that high level learning skills that I was talking about, the verbal reasoning. And we are also every session we are also mapping in a little bit of planning time. We plan our session together and then we check our plan at the end. We learn to make a mind map of the text that we're working on. We work out how best to organise the folders that we're putting the work in, and I tend to weave it all into very functional situations for the young people because they struggle with that generalisation. So I try to make it as meaningful as possible for them. And I think it's really important that we are at least trying to address the executive functioning side whilst we're doing these other interventions. And I'm not suggesting for a second that that's easy. If anybody knows a good programme specifically for that, I'm open to hearing about it, but I'm not aware of one. So I think it's just, we often get so focused on the individual language skills, but we need to kind of keep an eye on what we're trying to achieve for the children really as they get older and become adults, because we're often working with families, aren't we, that are always that also struggle with these things, and that makes us supporting them very complicated. So I haven't got a quick answer on executive functioning. The Smart but Scattered books are quite nice. They deal with it. There's also a lady from a speech and language perspective, if any of you are Instagram people, there's a lady called Tara Sumpter, TERA SUMPTER, I think, and she is an American speech therapist, and she does all her speech and language work through the frame of executive functioning. So she gets very angry that we tend to take skills and treat them as kind of splinter SLCN skills when actually the underlying problem is executive functioning skills. So she's quite a good person to watch for tips and that kind of thing. Okay, so if you follow any of my social media accounts, I'm often talking about early years and primary on my social media, and you may have heard me use this phrase because I use it all the time. Every interaction is an intervention, and I think it's really easy when we're picking up one published intervention or another. It's really easy for us to get focused on those and forget that actually probably the best thing we can do for our young people is talk to them more and listen to them more. And I think that really gets squeezed out a lot of times, particularly because as they become teenagers, they don't really want to talk to us anymore. They want to talk to each other. But I think I will always encourage people in the schools I'm in, if they're running those interventions and following a programme, to just leave room really for those conversations, because it's the conversations with the young people that lets you tailor what you're doing to their interests. And really, communication exists in the context of human relations, doesn't it? And so what's it for if we're not going to use it in the context of human interaction, really? So I think it's really important that we advocate for those interactions to stay in our day and stay in our intervention time, and just don't get too prescriptive, to feel confident to go off piece sometimes and let conversations run their course, because I think sometimes we're the only person that a young person might have really properly talked to all day. And I really value those times when I bump into somebody in a corridor and have a little chat, or they come and hang around your door when you're in school, and all those times are interventions too. And I will fight for those moments to the death, basically, from a speech therapy perspective. Okay, so I hope that was useful. That's a bit of a scattergun approach to intervention, but just to give you some kind of framework to address your planning of interventions from. So in summary, really, we need to start thinking about focusing on those strategy-based interventions much earlier, in my opinion. So from Key Stage 2, thinking about the skills they're going to need going forward. Intervention at Key Stage 2 and 3 is really complex, I won't lie, and it is often needing to pull together lots of strands. So, we slightly artificially pull off vocabulary as a skill, or memory as a skill, but actually they're all related, and increasingly so as you get older. So I do think that the people delivering often need to be really highly skilled at this stuff. And it is at secondary, I think the reason why people don't publish more programs at secondary is because secondary children are just so individual. So you can have two young people with the same profile, but they present extremely differently, they cope extremely differently. And so I do think, if you've got people delivering your interventions at secondary, and even at Key Stage 2, you do need to be a bit of a jack of all trades to be able to follow children's interest a bit and sort of pull in the skills that you're trying to develop. But what I would say is that whatever interventions you have time for, whichever ones you prioritise, that the generalisation of those skills and explicit practice is in the everyday situations, that's what really makes the interventions work. And I do understand that that's really difficult to pull off. But the fact is that a lot of our children with SLCN, they're just not going to pick up the stuff that the rest of us just sort of work out as we go. We need to make the skills that we're teaching them extremely explicit, and then remind them very explicitly, because they won't, the subtleties of realizing this situation is a little bit like that one I had in the intervention, and I could use that skill again. It's just too much. They're often working extremely hard just to get the basic language processing done. So we need to be planning that in and trying to spend as much time as we can educating the staff about what SLCN looks like and what sort of skills we need to be encouraging in the classroom. Okay, I just haven't mentioned, I didn't put on the slide, but like I said, the absolute best approach for SLCN is obviously to have an assessment to go off. I'm aware that that doesn't necessarily happen for people, and what I did forget to put on the slides was the only programs that I'm aware of that have a sort of baselining sort of function or a sort of screening function. There is, and I'm not familiar with them, I've not used them, the Speech Link Secondary Language Link. I don't know, some of you might use the Speech Link packages at primary. I'm not terribly familiar, but they do essentially screening for you and help you work out which intervention groups to put children in and what those interventions need to look like. And the other thing that's available at secondary is the ICANN groups. So I don't know if any of you in primary use the Talk Boost groups, but there is a sort of secondary equivalent. It's called Talk for Work. ICANN's got loads of nice resources on their website, actually, things you can download to share with teachers and that kind of thing. Things about developmental language disorder. So well worth having a look at their website. So their Talk for Worker, that is a viable program. Again, I can't say that I've delivered it, but when I was looking around for things that would kind of give you a screening element and a baselining element, those were the two main ones. Though, like I say, that Language for Behaviour and Emotions does also have a really nice initial assessment as well for you to baseline from. Okay, so if you want to find me anywhere, I'm all over the place. So I really, I've been trying to talk about secondary more because I think it's a bit of a neglected topic. So if there's anything you'd like to know about, just come and find me. So I've got a Facebook page called Find the Key Speech and Language Therapy. I've also got a group called Talk SLCN that you're very welcome to ask questions in. I'm on LinkedIn as Angharad Welch. Find the Key SLT1 on Instagram. And here are my website details as well. And that's my email if anybody's got anything specific they'd like to ask me.
And thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Angharad.
Thank you.